Israel, the western beacon of light in the Middle East, and the homeland of the Jewish people, is under threat. The virus of anti-Semitism has spread like wildfire throughout the world now. It's the year 2025 and Jewish lives are at risk now more than ever. The anti-Semitisms of the early 20th century are now echoed in today's rhetoric. On full display for the world to see, and instead of being condemned, it is cheered. I could no longer stand by and watch the outright lies about Israel and the Jewish people. These lies need to be exposed to the light of truth before it is too late. These one-sided narratives are leading everyone down a dark path that humanity will never recover from. There is trouble in Doha. Israel attacks terrorists in another country? This must be another violation of international law. But is it actually? Let's take a look at the events surrounding Israel's precision strike on the leadership of Hamas in Qatar, and explain to those who just can't seem to understand that not only is this completely legally within the parameters of international law, it is actually upheld by it. Almost 1 month ago, on September 9th, Israel initiated a strike against senior Hamas leaders in Doha, the capital of Qatar. The dust is only just beginning to settle, with Jerusalem increasingly pessimistic that its attack was successful. What has been perfectly plain to see, however, is the outpouring of denunciations by the international community against Israel over the attack, and allegations that it flies in the face of the laws of war. Condemnations by numerous countries, including close Israeli allies, focused on what was alleged to be Israel's violation of Qatari sovereignty, violations of international law, and concerns that the strike endangered negotiations with Hamas to bring the nearly 2-year-long war in Gaza to an end. Israel is currently engaged in an armed conflict with the Hamas terror and paramilitary organization. The officials targeted by Israel in the Doha strike are believed to have included all of the terror group's top leadership outside Gaza, including Khalil al-Hayya, the leader of Hamas's Gaza units, Zar Jabarin, who leads Hamas in the West Bank, Mohammed Darwish, the head of Hamas's Shura Council, Nazar Awad Allah, and Khalid Mashal, the head of Hamas abroad. Targeting Hamas leaders who are part of the chain of command and who are involved in military decision-making and operational matters. This would therefore broadly be considered to be lawful under the laws of armed conflict. But conducting such strikes in a country with which Israel is not in a state of armed conflict, like Qatar, raises considerable legal issues. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, states are afforded the right to self-defense. The International Court of Justice, a part of the UN, has however interpreted this right narrowly to mean that member states may only carry out such attacks in response to threats from other member states, and not from armed groups, such as Hamas. The view according to the ICJ is therefore that states do not have an automatic right to self-defense against non-state actors, and at the very least should seek cooperation from the host state, absent which they should approach the UN Security Council. Nevertheless, in recent decades, major nations such as the US, the UK, and Turkey have challenged this interpretation. Such countries have carried out strikes against terrorist organizations and paramilitary groups, especially in the wake of the September 11th al-Qaeda attacks against the US in 2001. The US has targeted members of such organizations even in countries with which it is not in an armed conflict, such as Pakistan, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and beyond. Professor Yuval Shani, an expert in international law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, points out that these attacks typically take place in failed and lawless states, or regions of unstable countries where the writ of the government does not extend to all parts of its territory. One notable campaign involved repeated U.S. airstrikes against Taliban and al-Qaeda operatives in Pakistan's Waziristan region in the first 2 decades of the century, as well as members of other jihadi organizations present in Waziristan. These types of attacks are part of what has become known as the unwilling or unable doctrine. whereby if a country is unwilling or unable to stop the activity of an armed group engaged in an armed conflict with another state, that state can target the armed group in the host country. Shani said, however, that it is not clear that before the strike, Qatar had been confronted by the Israeli government with a choice of removing Hamas from its territory or facing the consequences of Israel operating there. You need to prove that the host state is unwilling and unable to stop a concrete threat against you, but you have to apply a set of facts that support this, Shani asserted. In this situation, we are at the very least in a gray zone. In a statement issued on Wednesday, a day after the attack, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he was telling Qatar and all nations who harbor terrorists, you either expel them or you bring them to justice. Because if you don't, we will. This would appear to be an allusion to the unwilling or unable doctrine. Some commentators have argued that Article 51 of the UN Charter provides Israel with the right to act in self-defense against the Hamas leaders in Gaza because Israel was left with no choice since, according to their argument, those Hamas leaders continued to refuse US-brokered deals to end the war. Others have claimed that no such protections exist, and this is the problem. International law is crafted to fit the ideal actions a nation-state must do when confronting an opposing nation-state. When you have rogue actors in the shadowy world of international terrorism, safe havens for militants aren't minor inconveniences. They're enabling terrorism by legitimizing them as honest actors. Israel's recent precision strike in Doha, aimed at eliminating key leaders of Hamas who orchestrated the October 7th massacre and the kidnapping of hostages, was a bold and lawful act of self-defense. This position that Israel is breaking international law not only betrays a stunning ignorance of international law, it also undermines the global fight against terrorism. A nation that prides itself on upholding the rule of law should be condemning Qatar's complicity, not Israel's resolve. Let's be clear, the Hamas officials targeted in Doha were not innocent diplomats sipping tea in exile. They were high-ranking members of the organization's political bureau, the nerve center that directs Hamas's blend of governance and terror. Often mislabeled as a mere political wing, this body sets strategies that fuel abhorrent acts of terrorism targeting civilians, from rocket barges to suicide bombings. Under the expansive view of military targeting in international law, as outlined in the United States Law of War Manual, any individual who's functionally part of a non-state armed group like Hamas and shares in its hostile intent is a legitimate target. Even under a more restrictive lens, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross's Guidelines on Direct Participation in Hostilities, DPH. These leaders qualify. The DPH includes those with a continuous combat function, involving the preparation, execution, or command of hostile acts. Consider the facts. Khalil al-Hayya, one of the targets, coordinated with Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps ahead of October 7th, even soliciting intelligence for the attack, according to the New York Times. Zar Jabareen, another one of the targets, oversaw suicide operations from the West Bank. The group was also reportedly convening to deliberate on hostage negotiations, a grotesque euphemism for deciding the fate of innocents kidnapped in a barbaric raid with genocidal intent. Hostage-taking is terrorism incarnate, and the involvement of these men in sustaining it strips them of any civilian protections. Israel's action wasn't vengeance, it was a targeted disruption of an ongoing threat. International law has long rejected the absurd notion that terrorists gain immunity simply by crossing borders into sympathetic states. This principle underpinned the United Nations Security Council's resolution authorizing action against Afghanistan, despite the Taliban's denials of involvement in al-Qaeda's plots. It also justified the 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, a supposed ally. NATO allies invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter to support these efforts, treating an attack on one as an attack on all. Something people seem to conveniently forget. More recently, the threat posed by ISIS prompted a coalition response, with strikes in Syria and Iraq under the unwilling or unable doctrine. Canada used this doctrine to justify its participation in the war in a 2015 letter to the UN Security Council, which affirmed states' rights to self-defense when a host government can't or won't curb threats emanating from its soil. This precedent fits Qatar like a glove. Doha isn't a neutral bystander. It's a willing accomplice, and for that, there must be a price to pay. Qatar has positioned itself as Hamas's premier patron, offering political cover, lavish exile, and billions in funding that sustain the group's terror machine. Leaders like Khaled Mashal and Musa Abu Marzouk have called Doha home for years, coordinating campaigns of annihilation from five-star hotels. Over the years, Qatar has funneled over $1.8 billion to Hamas in Gaza, and its state-run Al Jazeera network acts as Hamas's propaganda arm. This isn't passive hosting, it's active facilitation, rooted in ideological ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. By any measure, Qatar is unwilling or unable to rein in Hamas more accurately. In light of this, the international community's finger-wagging at Israel reeks of hypocrisy. They all once stood firm against those who harbor terrorists, now risks alienating a democratic ally fighting for its survival. Israel's strike was not just defensible, it was imperative. Anything less invites more chaos, bloodshed, and tramples the memories of those lost on October 7th and the thousands who've died before and after. Please help us and share our videos. Support Jewish lives, and I encourage you to speak out as we are doing now, before it is too late.